Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. We have a special guest, Don. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. Can you please introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Hey, well, thanks a lot, Robbie. My name is Don Lattin, Lattin. DonLattin.com is my website. And I'm an author and a journalist. Written several books about the so-called psychedelic revival over the last 10 or 12 years. I was a reporter for many years at the San Francisco Chronicle, covering religion, spirituality, psychology, kind of religion broadly defined, as we do here in San Francisco.
So how'd you get interested in psychedelics?
Well, like many baby boomers, I came of age in the late 60s and early 70s. I took some acid in high school in the late 60s as a teenager and had some interesting experiences, nothing that dramatic. And then I came up to Berkeley to go to school in 1972 and had some just revelatory, mind-blowing LSD trips on the coast of Big Sur. And then I had some kind of the bad trip from central casting, some horrific trips in the middle of a hunting lodge. And they say be careful about set and setting with psychedelics, being a safe place. Well, I had a bad trip because I was kind of a hippie and I was surrounded by rednecks hunting and shooting off rifles. So that's a recipe for a bad trip, right? So anyway, I like many people my age, I did a lot of experimentation with psychedelics, as a young person. So that's how I originally got interested in it. And I did have, some very profound mystical revelatory experiences. And I always was kind of wondering, well, what is going on with that? And it did spark an interest in meditation and kind of religion and spirituality. And it's one of the reasons I wound up kind of specializing in that as a reporter, not just writing about psychedelics, but writing about religion, spirituality, psychology as a journalist. So, and then eventually I wrote the first of three books on this. This is one that's called The Harvard Psychedelic Club, which came out in 2010. So it's about 12 years old, by HarperCollins. And that's a group biography of four guys who came together at around Harvard in 1960. Timothy Leary, Richard Alpert, who went on to become the spiritual teacher Ram Dass, Andrew Weil, the holistic health and integrative medicine guru, and Houston Smith, the professor of religion and philosophy. So it's that book, which did fairly well, really looked at the whole psychedelic 60s through the story of these four guys. And then after that, I've done a couple other books.
I want to ask about those four guys. Do you think they really unlock something with this mystical drug that everyone talks about unlocking your? I've never taken it. I've never taken acid, never taken LSD. I feel like I would have a horrible trip, but I've heard great experiences from people, and it had me looking into the history of it, obviously getting involved with the government a little bit as well too. But then when I came across Timothy Leary's name, and he was kind of like this guy that felt like he should give the key to everyone to be able to unlock this potential out of this drug as well too. And he was also the person that said the set and setting kind of phrase. And it had me wondering who this character was and knowing more about him and also the other people that were involved.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure that Leary certainly didn't come up with the idea of the importance of set and setting. He may have been the one to use those words, but I'm not even sure about that. But anyway, I mean, Leary gets the credit and the blame for a lot of things that are not really appropriate. But yeah, Leary was a fascinating character. I call him the trickster in the book. I have like archetypes for the four characters. So Leary is the trickster, and he was a brilliant psychologist. I mean, before he ever discovered psychedelics, I mean, he had a very successful and well-received book on personality assessment. That was his, like, as a psychologist, that was his background. But he was working in the 50s at a psychiatric clinic at Kaiser Hospital, actually in Oakland, not that far from where I live. And he determined that, traditional talk therapy really wasn't working that well for people. He did a little study of, patients who were waiting to be treated and those who got treated at the clinic, and sort of lost his faith in traditional, Freudian or behavioral psychology, and was kind of ready to find something new when a friend turned him on to mushrooms in the summer of 1960 on a vacation in Mexico. And he had a very profound experience, sitting around a swimming pool with a bunch of friends and kind of rolling around with one of his many girlfriends at the time. It was like a party, really. It wasn't a controlled clinical trial or anything. It was basically a party around a pool in Mexico at a resort. But anyway, he had a profound religious experience, and he was brought up Catholic. He had a very troubled childhood, so didn't think himself as a religious person at all, right? But he had this religious experience, which happens to a lot of people on psychedelics, and he became convinced that LSD was going to first revolutionize psychology, psychiatry, and eventually change the world, and embarked on a crusade that made him one of the most infamous characters of the 1960s.
I mean, when it comes to a religious experience, I mean, I definitely understand it better than talk therapy. I mean, everything I've ever heard is like going inside someone's mind and trying to unlock something. And people don't even know that they have demons, that they end up finding their demons on this trip and, befriending these demons. I've had plenty of friends explain their trips. It was an area about almost a year ago where I was really astounded by just people's experiences. I'm going to ask you what one of yours is at one point in this show, but it's just interesting to see its kind of growth from there. But it had me looking into, especially recently, was the war on drugs and trying to understand what this was and learning more about the hippie movement. I mean, this is a whole time my generation knows nothing about.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, Richard Nixon famously called Leary the most dangerous man in America. He became kind of like the self-appointed high priest of the psychedelic counterculture. He actually used that word himself, high priest, right? And so, yeah, he very quickly. It's a long story, but he and Richard Albrecht got kicked out of Harvard when their research, to put it simply, their research project kind of became more of a party than a research project, and they were giving they were giving psilocybin and LSD to undergraduates, which they had agreed to not do. All the research subjects were supposed to be graduate students or other people. So anyway, they got kicked out of Harvard, and they were ready to move on anyway. And so he became kind of a lightning rod, for not just for the psychedelic counterculture, but for the larger counterculture, the political counterculture, the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, the beginnings of the environmental movement. Not that Leary or Alpert were all that political in a traditional way, but what can happen with these drugs is they can just really expand your idea of what reality is or what is possible. And they really make you question reality and question authority. And that's what Leary was all about, is questioning authority. His mantra, turn on, tune in, drop out. It was like drop out of the system, man, drop out of the rat race, the consumerist, materialist culture of the 1950s. The subtitle of Harvard Psychedelic Club is, what is it? How Timothy Leary, Richard Alpert, Houston Smith, and Andrew Rao killed the 50s and ushered in a new age in America. So they were they were obviously the only ones doing this, but they were also kind of shameless self-promoters. So they really courted the media, got a lot of media attention, and became kind of the two symbols of the psychedelic counterculture, which the government did find dangerous on a lot of levels.
What happened with the fear of it? Like the government seeing it dangerous, is that when they decided to kind of blast it and label it as this like horrible thing in a sense where people, there are obviously a lot of people that took it, a lot of people that were hippies that were obviously sparking up protests, a lot of activism, but then there became this like fear and kind of demonization of it as well. Like if you don't want to live up in a dope society is usually what I always hear people say.
Yeah, well, on the one hand, there actually were a lot of people, a minority of people who took these drugs in the 60s and 70s who did have very difficult and negative experiences, and maybe even had psychotic breaks. These drugs are not harmless. They're not addictive drugs, but they can definitely cause ongoing psychological problems for people who aren't ready for them and don't have the right kind of guidance and help. So it wasn't that there was no reason to be concerned about this explosion in interest of, of LSD and, the famous out here in San Francisco, which was even wilder than what they were doing in Boston. You had like Ken Kesey and the acid tests, where they were, basically putting LSD in the punch and, having parties. And most people had a wonderful time.
I
But
never
some
heard about that. That's great. Wait, well, I've heard about
Oh yeah,
Operation Midnight
the
Climax, which
classic book on that is Tom Wolfe, the electric Kool-Aid acid test. You got to that
I've heard like
which is a
Operation
classic in
Midnight
so-called new journalism. So
Operation Midnight Climax I knew happened in San Francisco, which was dropping LSD in like John's drinks and stuff of that sort.
right, no, that was something that was earlier, and that was that. Yeah, that was an Army, U.S. Intelligence agency. Little experiment. No, this was not the government. This was Ken Kesey, who was like a very famous writer at the time. He wrote Sometimes a Great Notion and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So he had this band called the Mary Pranksters, which was right between the kind of beatnik scene and the hippie scene, like in the early 60s. And they had this, Dayglow bus, and they sort of a lot of the like stereotypes of the '60s, come out of the sort of Merry Pranksters and what Kesey was up to. My point was that there were a lot that, in a sense, the scene was a lot wild. The psychedelic scene was a lot wilder out in San Francisco than it was back in Boston, where Leary and Alpert were working. But yeah, I mean, it wasn't just LSD. I mean, Nixon pushed through the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, which upped penalties on a lot of drugs and criminalized a lot of drugs for the first time, and also increased penalties for like simple marijuana possession, right? And there's a famous quote. I'd have to look in the book to get the exact quote, but it was Ehrlichman, one of Nixon's top aides, like I think chief of staff or something, who basically confessed years later, like, well, we couldn't go after black people for supporting the civil rights movement or protesting. We couldn't go after the hippies and the new left anti-war demonstration people for protesting. That's legal. But we could go after their common pleasure, which was, marijuana, and psychedelics. So he admitted that it was really part of a political campaign against these groups. It wasn't what was fueling this was not that these drugs are inherently dangerous, even though they can be. That's my point.
I said that, and someone was like, "That's conspiracy talk." I was like, "What?" It's like the whole war on drugs. If you're like reading it and looking at it, it's like, why are they going after this thing so hard? It wasn't.
No, it's not conspiracy at all. I mean, there's a quote from Ehrlichman, who was like an architect of it, sort of admitting it. Of course, that's what we were doing. I mean, all drugs are made. I mean, drug laws are so crazy, and then by drugs, let's include alcohol, right? Which is like probably the most destructive drug in this culture, right? Maybe right with opiates, but alcohol's right up there. Like prohibition, right? Back in the 20s, a lot of that was a reaction against like Irish people and Italians, who were considered like, sort of outsiders or deviants in American culture at the time. People forget this, right?
Well, it created bootleggers, and then they even poisoned alcohol.
But a lot of the fueling prohibition was this idea that these Irish people are drinking too much and they're not going to work and blah blah. There's all, and then in the 80s you had the laws against, after the whole rave scene, people taking MDMA, ecstasy, Molly, called I guess now, during the rave scene. They outlawed that because they didn't like it's about who's taking the drugs more than how dangerous they really are. It's always been that way, all the way back to prohibition.
Well, even when they outlaw like something like LSD or something like that, and they have this full-on war against, these drugs, you get to this point where people are like, well, what the hell is going on? Like, you had major people that were musicians. I had John Potash on the show that talked about, all these musicians that are being activists, they're talking about drugs and all these types of things. I mean, they saw something, they realized something, and they're sitting there shouting for peace. And you start getting into this question where now it just sparks up the curiosity. Why is the government trying to ban that? And now you want to take the drug yourself and see what everyone else is seeing.
Right. And of course, the other thing that was happening, I mean, sort of prior to this, in the 1950s, the government itself was doing a lot of very nefarious experimentation, with LSD one of the first stories I wrote as a young reporter at the San Francisco Examiner, which was back in 1977, my first big banner headline, story in the newspaper was about, it didn't revealed, but there were these U.S. Army intelligence drug tests, psychedelic tests back in the 50s and early 60s. And there was an African American soldier who was experimented on in France. He was stationed in Europe, given massive doses of LSD and basically tortured or interrogated in a very hostile way. Maybe not exactly tortured, but when you give someone a high dose of LSD and you try to drive them crazy, that's psychological torture, right? And they were doing experiments basically to see if LSD could be used as a interrogation tool, for prisoners of war. And there was all kinds of crazy experiments, like to spray LSD on enemy troops as like a weapon of mass distraction, rather than destruction. There was all kinds of crazy stuff going on that the government was sponsoring, much worse than anything that
MK
Larry or
Ultra.
Alfred or Ken Kesey were up to, right? And so a lot of the crackdown on psychedelic research in the late 60s and 70s was the government kind of worrying about trying to clean up their own house, right? It wasn't just that they were going after the psychedelic counterculture, because what people don't kind of remember is all this information about what was going on in the 50s didn't come out until the 70s. It wasn't known until the 70s. After Watergate, there were these hearings in the Senate about all the secret kind of government activities on all kinds of levels, right? Surveillance and including the LSD. So that's why when I stumbled across this story in 1977, it was that era. It was the post-Watergate kind of let's clean up the government kind of crusade. Jimmy Carter was president. It was that was that era. So people will blame Timothy Leary, the excesses of Timothy Leary for the shutting down the research into psychedelics, the beneficial uses of psychedelics, and he's part of it. But as much of it was what I think the government, trying to kind of cover up or repent for its sins in this area.
I'm glad you mentioned that because usually when I say it, people go, that's conspiracy. I bring up MK Ultra all the time. I bring up a lot of the government's uses. I mean, I have documents that'll tell you that they can revive old methods of LSD interrogations to use on people that were like, caught for covert action or something like that. And it's just like, yeah, this is a really kind of like weird, dark part that really doesn't get talked about was the government buying up all LSD. And then there's these weird tie-ins where it's like, why are they just out? Like, I would thought that they would have communicated with Timothy Leary at a point, not like a double agent type thing, but just reached out to him like, hey, because if you look at like Joyanne West, who was involved in MK Ultra, and you look at Sidney Gottlieb, who I had Stephen Kinzer talk about on the show. He wrote a book called Poisoner in Chief. They're from Harvard or Yale, and they're psychologists. And I'm like, that fit Timothy Leary's description perfectly. And it had me just interested, like, has education systems or just systems in general, normal stuff that's to an average civilian, always had this kind of influence or this experimentation on these types of drugs?
Not exactly sure what you mean by the question, but
Has
I
there
mean,
always been like influence from psychedelic drugs and like, I mean, just experiments on them, not just government stuff, but I mean, just classical schools as well too.
I mean, yeah. So LSD was basically synthesized by this Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann in the late 30s. He didn't really discover what he had on his hands until towards the end of World War II, right in the 1940s. And this was an amazingly powerful psychedelic drug. I mean, they already had mescaline had been synthesized, so there were psychedelics. Of course, there were it's a long history of sacred plant medicines and indigenous culture and all that. That's something else. But it was really the discovery of LSD by Hofmann, in the mid 1940s. And very soon after that, I mean, all kinds of things were happening simultaneously. I mean, Sandoz, which was it's a big drug company, right? They were looking for some way to market this and how to use this drug. So they were sending free samples out to psychologists and psychiatrists all over the world. The rules were much looser then about experimental drugs and research, and the rights of human research subjects. All that was this was another era, really, in the 1950s. So all kinds of people were trying to figure out, wow, this drug is amazing. Maybe it can tell us how the mind works. Maybe it can be a great new tool in psychiatry and psychology, which it can be, and it is, right? We're seeing that now. But at the same time, you had the government, and this was the Cold War, right? There was all this paranoia about the communists, right? I mean, and it was really what started this is there were reports that the Soviet Union had purchased like something like 30 million doses of LSD. Like the CIA heard about this, and so they were basically, it was sort of like a Cold War around psychedelics. Both the Soviets and the Americans and other countries were wondering maybe we can use this drug for, intelligence or military purposes. So, both sides in the Cold War were doing this experimentation.
Is that Men Who Stare at Goats where they were creating psychological warriors, trying to use like remote viewing and all that stuff?
Well, that was, I think, wasn't that kind of a fictional
No,
movie?
that's 100% real. That happened at
Oh,
Fort
okay.
Detrick.
Okay. Yeah, okay. Well, there were all kinds of there's some really funny videos of this. There's a great video of like the British were doing experiments where they gave these infantrymen LSD and they
Yeah.
made them go out on maneuvers, and they start like throwing down their rifles and laughing and climbing up on trees and playing, I mean, what the army and the CIA eventually sort of learned that these drugs really don't work, right, as truth serums. Or there really wasn't a clear like military use for these, so they kind of eventually dropped it. But there were casualties along the way, and most infamous being Frank Olson, that whole story. I mean, I don't really, I know about a little bit about all this, but I don't really, the guys who wrote the two definitive books, at least early on, about this were Acid Dreams and Storming Heaven. Those are the two books that came out, I think, in the 80s about the government secret government psychedelic research. So
What?
no, that's definitely not a conspiracy theory. I mean, some people, there's a conspiracy theory out there that people think that the current some people on the fringe of the psychedelic movement now think that the current research into psychedelics by groups like MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, which I write about a lot in this book, Changing Our Minds, that they're part of this government conspiracy, which I think is total bullshit. So that's one version of the conspiracy theory, right? But
Could you tell
I
me a
don't.
little bit about MAPS?
Well, MAPS is an organization that kind of grew up in the 1980s. They were people who were there were therapists who were using MDMA. This is before MDMA really became a party drug and was really well known in like the youth culture or the rave culture. So basically there's been an underground of legitimate, sincere psychotherapists using psychedelics to help patients since the 60s, right? Some of this was above ground, and they started outlawing psychedelics in the 60s, and it went underground, right? So this has been going on for decades. And then in the 80s, there was a lot of interest in MDMA, using MDMA to help people with trauma, with PTSD. And it wasn't underground because MDMA wasn't illegal yet. But what happened is then MDMA got discovered as a party drug, right? And then the government cracked down on it. So there's a guy named Rick Doblin who started MAPS, who basically went on a crusade to convince the government that MDMA should be reclassified, not necessarily legalized initially, but reclassified by the FDA so it could be used by trained therapists to help people with trauma and PTSD and other mood disorders. So MAPS and Rick Doblin have been working diligently for now 30 years to try to get MDMA rescheduled so it could be used by trained therapists, not completely legalized. So that's what MAPS has been doing. Now, there are a few people who think, oh, the MAPS is part of this government conspiracy to drug people and get them to not be political. And I mean, that to me is a crazy conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
And it's a small group of people, but they're very influential, and they're so there's sort of a division in the psychedelic movement now. Some people are sort of buying into that, but
Well,
I'm not a believer in that conspiracy theory.
is the overall public starting to look into now? I mean, at least take notice the fact that the whole psychedelic movement is now changing to this aspect of. I mean, I get there's a dark history behind it.
Yeah, oh yeah, definitely. So that's why I call this book "Changing Our Minds,"
That's why I'm leading into it. I'm leading into it.
which by the way came out about a year and a half before Michael Pollan's better known book, "How to Change Your Mind." that's. But anyway, yeah, because people that's sort of a play on by changing our minds. I mean, the public opinion is changing about the potential benefits or the real benefits of psychedelic assisted therapy, and also these drugs can change our minds. They can actually change the way we think and experiencing reality, and it can in a very positive way if done carefully and cautiously.
Can I ask an experience that you had that really changed your perception on things?
Well, I mentioned, when I was in college, right? I read about this in the afterword of Harvard Psychedelic Club. If you've read that book, I think you said
Yeah.
have you read it? I don't know. Did you read that book?
Harvard Psychedelic Club?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so that's the
Yeah.
one. Yeah, that's the first one. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So maybe you remember at the end of that book, there's something about me in that book until an afterward, and I write a little bit about what inspired me to write it. And basically, I had well, I was 19 years old. I thought I knew everything, but I really knew very little. As a lot of 19-year-olds. Right. So I went down. I was first year student at University of California, Berkeley, and I had a new girlfriend, and we went down to Big Sur, and we dropped a fairly large dose of LSD, and just had an amazing experience of kind of unity and love and transcendence, and which you can have on your own with the universe and the world on these drugs. With me, it was wrapped up with this kind of new romance with this girl, this young woman, and I became convinced that we melted together. And then, like, for days and weeks afterwards, every time we touched, we would physically melt together. There was like this lingering, and in my naive 19-year-old head, I had this idea that, oh, that's what love is. That's what people, when they say becoming one with someone else. And I was convinced that we were going to be together for our whole lives, and this was magic, and this was wonder. And it was also a connected feeling with the whole universe, with nature. One of the main components of a mystical experience is a unitive experience. It's almost a cliche. You feel one with everything, right? But it's real. You do feel that, right? Sometimes. So anyway, but then a couple months later, we were up with some other dorm mates of ours at Berkeley, and we had another experience, four of us with this same LSD. And I had like the flip side of that, right? It was paranoia, it was fear, it was terror. I felt like I was shrinking and disappearing in a kind of a frightening way, right, rather than a unitive way. So anyway, basically, I had these two trips, right? One was wonderful, and one was terrifying. And and then I split up with this girl, and so she said she was, I had too much dark energy or something, And so, but that kicked off a very difficult time in my life for just a period of a few months where I never really came down off the LSD. I mean, I would have like flashbacks. They used to warn you. One part of I thought it was anti-drug propaganda, right? That you can have flashbacks like, weeks or months later.
If you crack your back.
No. Flashbacks, mental flashbacks.
I'm about to say, usually, when people, my grandpa always says this because my grandpa tripped on acid a lot. He's like, whenever I crack my back, I always get like an acid flashback.
Oh, yeah. No, an acid flashback is basically you're going to start hallucinating, for no apparent reason. I mean, so there's like it's even a syndrome, this disorder of people who the acid will kind of kick back in. And I used to think that was anti-drug propaganda, right? That story was put out just to scare people. Well, it actually happened to me. So that was very terrifying because I thought I'd permanently damaged my brain. I was a first year student at University of California. I couldn't read a sentence. My mind was I could, like, one word in a sentence would take me off on a tangent, and I'm, first year student at Cal, right? So I had hallucinations. I stopped smoking pot. I didn't take any drugs. And like for weeks, I would occasionally have these It was sort of a temporary psychotic break, you know. Now it's rare. That's a very rare thing, but it did happen to me. But it's not, you know, unheard of by any means. So I guess I tell both those stories, and that always left me very curious and also cautious at the same time about the power of psychedelics. Those two personal experiences.
Now, with the era where we're heading in now, where it's leading more into the area of microdosing and people having experiences that way. What do you think about microdosing? I mean, I don't know if it's the full benefit of giving like this spiritual trip. And I've heard amazing experiences of it, and I have heard some horror stories, but the overall answer is kind of this amazing experience about it. And I'm like, well, you don't get that from microdosing, but it does solve the problems that people experience: PTSD, depression. I have a friend, her name is, I think it's, oh, I might be blanking on it. It's about 400 episodes ago. Joya Trebek, I think her name is. She leads the psilocybin mushroom movement in Canada to help get those legalized.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, okay. There's a lot of misunderstanding about microdosing. Um, most of the all of the clinical trials that are going on, and there are many of them now, with mostly with psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. So it's the synthesized version of the drug that's in magic mushrooms, and MDMA, the drug I was just talking about with Rick Doblin and MAPS. That's not that they're not doing microdosing; they're doing macrodosing. The way that these drugs work in terms of a psychedelic assisted therapy is people have a profound, powerful experience, which takes a macro dose, not a significant dose, not a microdose. So all the research that's going on has nothing to do with microdosing. Microdosing is a movement of people who believe that taking a very small dose, right, like a tenth of a normal dose of whether it's LSD or mushrooms, which are usually the two that are used, it's supposed to be a dose where you don't feel anything. Like it's a subliminal effect, right? A true microdose, like if you take something and you like just the colors seem a little brighter, or you feel a little like you're a little high on psychedelics, that's too much for a true microdose. Then you should take less the next time. So that's what a microdose is, right? But people say that doing this on a regular basis, I mean, one of the protocols, Jim Fadiman, who wrote a book about this, who's an old psychedelic researcher from way back and a friend of mine, what you take a microdose one day, 2 days off, and then the next day you do another microdose, right? And some people report, a lot of people report that it improves their, in subtle ways, right? It improves their mood. It may improve creativity, may help with depression. I'm basically agnostic on it. I've tried it. I tried it with mushrooms, and I didn't really see much. I think a lot of it, because it is subliminal, I think a lot of it could be a bit placebo effect,
Yeah.
you know, which is not an issue really with a true dose, because you know you're getting. I mean, that's why a lot of this, that's a whole other side. This double-blind, placebo-controlled study with high-dose psychedelics is kind of silly, because everybody knows who's getting the real dose and who's getting the placebo on these clinical trials. But they have to do that because that's what the FDA requires to reschedule a drug. There is some research. There finally is some research coming out with microdosing, not just anecdotal accounts of people saying, "Oh yeah, wow, man, you know, I did this and I feel so much more creative," or actual studies where they could try to measure effects of microdosing, and it's been very mixed. And it seems to be pointing to the fact that a lot of this may be placebo effect. I'm not against the placebo effect. I mean, if you think it works and it makes you happier, great, right? But I'm a little skeptical personally about microdosing. But it's kind of too soon to really say definitively.
I would say you'd have to go all in and just do a trip, do a macro dose or something, because the experiences I've heard of people where they talk, I mean, I've seen people that were completely atheist and never believed in religion start to become spiritual after that, or believe in
Yeah,
something,
that's
a
not going to
higher
happen.
power.
That's not going to happen with a microdose unless you're like incredible. I mean, the other thing is people are all very different about how sensitive they are to these, and it's a very individual thing. You never know what's going to happen until you do it yourself. So there's that part of it. But yeah, the microdosing is, I don't think it's going to hurt. A lot of people, they say they're doing a microdose. They're doing what I call, or other people call, a museum dose. A museum dose is like just enough that you could still maybe go out and walk around in the world maybe even drive, although that's probably not advisable, and go to a museum, right? And look at art while you're slightly high, right? Just to get it, that's just one example. To get a deeper appreciation of art or something, right? That's a museum dose. That's not a microdose. A microdose, you shouldn't even have any sort of conscious level. You shouldn't have. It should be totally a subliminal effect for a true microdose.
Do you think that an actual like macro dose, do you think it could actually lead to just, I mean, major strides in innovation and just progress in a lot of ways? Like we know about like peaceful like progress in that sense, but I mean, I've heard people say like people like thoughts of AI getting linked with LSD and just getting linked with tripping. I mean, even Kerry Mullis, who invented the PCR test, he did that while he was on acid.
Yeah, no, there are others like the guy. What's his name? Douglas. Wrote this book a long time ago, Robbie. So excuse me, but
You're good.
Engelbart, I think the guy. He's the guy who invented the mouse, the computer mouse.
Holy shit. Thank God for that guy.
Yeah, yeah. He invented the mouse, and he says he got the idea for that on LSD. Steve Jobs has said that his trips kind of helped him come up with the concept of Apple. So yeah, that is totally understandable because what these drugs do is they kind of radically shift your perception of yourself and the rest of in the outside world, self and other. They really can put you in and that's why they're so effective for treating things like can be effective for treating things like depression or PTSD or addiction. It's basically it's psychological and it's spiritual in my those things are all mixed together. It's basically reimagining yourself and connecting with a sort of quieting down the normal I, me mind, the egoic self, right? That's always like sort of worried about our own kind of identity and stuff. Blowing that away, you could call it ego dissolution, right? Where your normal small self, kind of I, me, my, consciousness either subsides and you feel like you're connecting to some cosmic higher consciousness, and it can feel like a true self, right? Or another self. And it's that experience. And I've interviewed a lot of people, like research subjects in these clinical trials, who like cured their PTSD, cured their depression, cured their, substance abuse. And I think what happens it's just this radical re-understanding, reimagining of how your sort of mind relates to the rest of the world and other people. And the power of that can kind of shake people out of an old pattern, whether it's like being an alcoholic or depressed, especially when it's done with a trained guide or therapist who knows how to deal with these states. I'm not talking about just taking acid and going out to a party or something. I'm talking about in a controlled setting with a trained guide.
If I toss this out to you, which is like a recommendation for something that maybe would be a good idea to do, would it be easier to have like individual guides and have a whole system, like I wouldn't say a business, but like a little therapy thing? I know people have retreats that they go to and they can try these drugs, but like, I mean, do you think one day it'll get to the point where it's on like a street corner where you can actually see people go in and explore?
Yeah, that's what's happening right now. That's what's really interesting. I mean, there's a big debate about the whole medicalization of this, So the goal of the people who have been pushing for decriminalization of psychedelic assisted therapy is exactly that, to have like an above ground, therapy centers or there's therapists who are already therapists, but can basically psychedelics will be just another tool in the toolbox of therapy, along with like traditional antidepressants, SSRIs, which do help a lot of people but don't work for millions of people, right? So yeah, just another tool. So that's starting to, I mean, there's been an underground therapy, psychotherapy thing going on for decades. It's coming above ground now. And the state of Oregon has passed a law a couple years ago. It goes into effect next year, so next January 1st, 2023, which will not just decriminalize, they've decriminalized all drugs in Oregon, all drugs. It's like a traffic ticket now. That's one thing. But at the same time, there was two measures. One, basically, any drug, if you're cutting any drug, even heroin or cocaine, it's $100 fine, right? You're not going to go to jail.
Holy shit.
That's already the law. That's the law in Oregon right now. And the $100 fine, if you like agree to like just call a hotline, like for help for like recovery or addiction or something, you don't have to pay the $100. So they've basically decriminalized possession of all drugs in Oregon. At the same time, they have a whole other thing, another initiative that passed, which is setting up supervised centers where people can go and have magic mushroom experiences with a guide legally. And they're regulating it. They're controlling the quality of the mushrooms. They've been, for the last 2 years in Oregon, they've been setting up this system, and it'll be the first in the country where you could just walk into a sort of like a center, a therapy center. They're not calling it therapy. They're just calling it supervised sessions. So it's not necessarily, you don't have to have a psychiatric disorder to qualify, right? Anyone can go in there, and that's going to be available starting next year. So this is happening. This is going to spread across the country, unless there's a huge backlash against it. But this is happening now. It's happening right now.
Where would you like to see, in your eyes, like the next 10 years? Where would you like to see us be? Or next 5 years, if you want?
Well, I'd like to see more of these centers, retreat centers. I mean, I'm interested. Lately, I've been actually interested in kind of how this fits into the larger story of religion in America, right? So there's this kind of more, kind of psychological therapy kind of use. There's also kind of religious use. So there are churches that have underground churches that have been using psychedelics for decades, very quietly. They're starting to come. I say churches, sometimes not the sense of a church, like, a building with a steeple we think of, but like, groups of people who get together, right? But in a focused kind of spiritual, or you could even say religious way, to try to connect with the divine through these substances. And that's coming above ground too. And these people will argue that because of the constitutional guarantees of freedom of religion, right, that the government has no right to tell me that I can't explore my own consciousness. It's an issue of cognitive freedom, which I'm 100% behind, right? And so that's also starting to come above ground. So there are 2 or 3 networks of churches that the FDA and the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and the Food and Drug Administration have basically authorized to do this above ground. They're both parts of, well, there's the Native American Church, which is also legal for them to, if you're Native American, the Native American Church can use peyote. That's been the case, since the 70s or 80s. But now there are these other 2 networks of churches that use ayahuasca, which is a plant-based psychedelic tea. They're churches that are in Brazil, but they have congregations up here in the States. So that's legal for them now. But what's happening is it's broadening. So other spiritual groups can openly and legally do this as part of their spiritual exploration. So there's kind of 2 tracks. There's the psychological and the religious. And I'm kind of been doing more work now looking at how this is changing, kind of American religion and ideas of what religion is in this country.
Do you think it's impacting it heavily? I mean, there's still like 47% of people that just choose either not to be religious or worship at home. I think it's going to change the whole
Right, and
idea
those
of
are the
religion.
people. Some of those people, not all, but some of those people are people that may be drawn to this, because this is a whole other way of looking at. I've written a lot about religion in America. That was my beat on the paper for 30 years, right? And during my time there, I really saw the rise of this group of people who say I'm spiritual but not religious. You hear that a lot from people. That's actually, you're right. Statistics show a deep drop in attendance and affiliation with mainstream religion, whether it's the Presbyterian Church, the Catholic Church, even evangelical churches are in decline now. It used to be the evangelical churches were growing, the more conservative churches were growing. Even they are like declining now. And the largest religious cohort group in the country now are, some people call the nuns, not N-U-N-E-S, N-O-N-E-S, nuns, as in, well, I'm spiritual, but not really interested in none of the above, right?
I always hear it.
The nuns, right? And these are people who call themselves spiritual but not religious. So I've been writing a lot about those people, and it's a much more amorphous kind of a spiritual path. but there are, you know, a lot of small groups, meditation groups, even like Bible study groups. You know, I mean, people who stop going to church, they don't all stop believing in God, or maybe they have a different idea of God, a different definition of God than they used to. So I think we're in a really, and you said how widespread this is, like with one of your questions. It's just starting. It's just starting. I did a long story. It's on, there's a website called lucid.news, lucid.news. If you can post a link to it, that would be helpful. A long story about some mainstream religious professionals, like, you know, Presbyterian ministers, Episcopal priests, right? Or, you know, seminary professors who are open to using psychedelics and in mainstream religion. It's just starting. There's still a lot of resistance to it in churches because churches tend to be conservative, right, in a lot of ways. But it's just starting to happen now. I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens in 10 or 20 years from now. I think a lot of churches are going, not that they're going to be like, you know, replacing the bread and the wine at communion with mushrooms and ayahuasca, although some already are doing that. But that say there'll be, you know, like a church retreat where once a year people from the church will go and have an experience with, say, mushrooms or LSD or MDMA and talk about it and try to integrate it into their understanding of their faith, understanding of Jesus, you know, looking at this in a new way. And that to me, that's really interesting, that how that is changing people's ideas about the divine and how they relate to that.
Will this lead probably to bigger communities, at least people becoming part of a community again, more communication aspects? I always figured that's what church was kind of for in the first place. The people that wanted to go to church necessarily didn't believe in maybe that definition of God or something, but they liked being around the
Right,
community that
sure,
believed the
exactly.
same thing.
Exactly. No, community is a big reason people get involved in religion. Community, you know, meaning, what's the meaning of life, you know? Also, you know, helping other people, you know, charitable work, you know. I mean, churches do a lot of really good things, you know. I mean, there's a dark side, of course, especially, you know, now with these nationalist, you know, evangelical kind of Trumpian, you know, churches that are getting a lot of attention, but yeah, it's a time of transition. I mean, I wrote a book way back in the 90s or around the millennium called Following Our Bliss, which was sort of looking at this shift of people who are looking at religion not as what's important is not doctrine or dogma or denominationalism, but personal spiritual experience, right? A powerful personal spiritual experience with the divine as you define it, right? As you experience it, not necessarily as the church teaches it or tells you what it is. And that it's those people that are, I think, part of the spiritual but not religious crowd. And these are not, most of these people are not using psychedelics. They might be using meditation or yoga or, you know, other techniques to have spiritual experiences. But psychedelics are definitely probably the easiest way to have that, have an experience, right? Some people say it's too easy, but that's not.
What do you think about just people's, I guess, never ending quest to try and understand consciousness? It's been a question I've asked people who literally, as a scientific study the area of consciousness, and hearing the reply, we don't know what it is. We have ideas, but nobody has a specific point. And I just go, if that doesn't get you interested in trying to understand what that is, that's why there's astral projection, there's lucid dreaming, there's all these different realms of consciousness. And I pulled up an article that was on the CIA, one of their documents, talking about the gateway experience, where they look into everything, the consciousness circle or the energy field around your head, and they had diagrams that were depicting it. It's like, so it's not new. This has been a revelatory old term for a really long time, and we're like now starting to see at least public media attraction to it.
Right. Well, I just actually, the last article I wrote for this website I mentioned, lucid.news, is about a new book that's out called The Varieties of Spiritual Experience. But one of the co-authors is one of the researchers at Johns Hopkins, which is the leading place where they're doing psychedelic assisted therapy work. Anyway, that's a play on a famous book that William James, who is the father of American psychology, wrote called The Varieties of Religious Experience. They're calling their new book Varieties of Spiritual Experience. Obvious play on that.
Yeah.
So yeah, so James was this is so this was this book came out in 1902, right? This is more than 100 years ago. This exact same question of what is consciousness? I mean, what is how are we aware of our own self, right? And when we connect to some when we connect to some thing that feels like a cosmic consciousness or a collective unconscious. Carl Jung, this famous Swiss psychologist, called it the collective unconscious. When we connect to that, are we really connecting to something that's out there, like our brain is like a radio kind of receiver, right? Or is it all in our head? It's just a projection, you know? So the people who don't believe in the divine or the supernatural say it's all in your head, right? You're not connecting to anything. It feels like you are, right? But it's all in the brain, right? It's not, you're not connecting to some. So these are people who would not believe in like telepathy, right? Or different kinds of paranormal phenomenon. And you know, and there is actually very little evidence. There's been very little research actually proving that paranormal phenomenon are real, you know? The people have been trying to like you know prove this forever, right? Well, but that's the question. Like, what is happening when you connect to this ultimate reality, this divine presence, this collective unconsciousness, whatever you want to call it? Is there really something out there or not? And you know, science hasn't answered that question really. It's called the hard problem of consciousness, and we're really no closer to understanding that than we were 100 years ago when William James wrote the Varieties of Religious Experience. Um, so I'm kind of agnostic on it myself. You know, I mean, I'm a journalist. I'm pretty skeptical, so I don't really fall into the believer category or the joiner category too easily. You know.
I
Yeah.
try and understand it. I think you could probably get caught up in your own head, and a lot of stuff can just be things that our brain does that might be mixed into a batch of something like that. But it seems like, I mean, I've never taken acid or LSD, but from the experiences I've heard, it seems like it takes you out of yourself and adds you into a bigger whole, which is the world. Well, I've smoked pot plenty of times, but that's my and whenever I explain a pot experience, people go, "Did you take mushrooms?" And I've always had a really adverse reaction to marijuana that gave me these like, and I would explain them. I've explained a couple on the show before, these real psychedelic trips. And I mean, I don't know what that is, but that's my reaction to marijuana. And that's why I kind of like stayed away from it because they were always horrible freaking trips. But they were something that I would explain to someone and people would just look at me, like, you were dosed something. I was like, I wasn't dosed. It was just
Well,
pot. But
you're probably Robbie. You're probably very sensitive to it. You know, I mean, I don't like the marijuana. I get kind of paranoid sometimes with marijuana. I don't with mushrooms or you know ketamine, which I've used as an alternative treatment for depression. That's another story. But or more powerful psychedelics like 5-MeO DMT, the so-called toad the toad
yeah.
medicine where it's very I never get paranoid with it, but marijuana for me I sort of get a little paranoid and a little stupid, you know, and I find so I'm not really drawn to it. But some of the marijuana today is so strong. It's such a high THC content that it is like a psychedelic experience. It really can be.
Well,
So
I have ADHD. It scared me so, and I looked it up. Some people with like ADHD and other disorders have sometimes an adverse reaction to it. And I was just like, well, it scared me off taking anything stronger than that. If I can't handle that basic, and that's what everyone kind of normally does, it's like I don't want to have like, and I'm missing out on that. You know, one day I might take LSD or something like that, but it's that fear of not coming back, which is what gets me. Is like I don't want to
right,
like
right.
trip and then
You have
never
to
come back.
remember that you are coming back. It can feel like you've died, and if you go into it with that understanding and you have a guide right who can reassure you, it can be very healing in a lot of ways. It really can. But you know these clinical trials that they're doing, and if that when they're setting up these new clinics that are just starting in Oregon, which I mentioned, you know they're going to screen people. You know, you have to go. You will do a battery of medical tests, or you'll fill out forms. Like if you have a pre-existing psychological condition, whether it's you know bipolar or maybe a attention deficit. I don't know if that would disqualify you, but anyway, they're you know these are people who have studied this and know you know that if you have this kind of a pre-existing condition, maybe this is not for you, right? And that's kind of hopeful about this is you're going to have people are going to have access to these powerful medicines and experiences, but in a cautious, controlled, you know, way. with some care about whether this is really what you want or need, or, so, and also just the fact that when you buy drugs on the street, you never know what you're getting. I mean, most stuff that's sold as Molly or ecstasy on the street is not Molly or ecstasy, or it's cut with other things. In some cases, fentanyl, which can kill you. So the other reason that I'm for legalization of basically all drugs, in my opinion, is that people should be able to get access to pure drugs. They should be able to know what they're taking. I mean, the driving drugs underground is what makes them so dangerous, because people are not going to stop getting high. People are always going to want to get high.
Well,
That's
even
a common human, desire.
yeah, but you notice that through histories that they hide that part of history. They hide that psychedelic tripping. I mean, the ancient Egyptians, they found, some mummies with cocaine in their dreads that they had. There was chalices that were laced with something like that. They were always hiding this era of trying to explore deeper, I guess I wouldn't say religious experience, but more spirituality aspects. And that's always been throughout our history. It's been like that. They've always hidden that one aspect.
Sure, in both Western and Eastern and indigenous, South American, North American culture. It's always been there. It's always been on the fringe. It's by its kind of very nature. It's on the fringe, but it's always been there.
Yeah, it's on the fringe until someone says it cured something, and then everyone's like, "Holy crap, we got to try that."
Well, that's what's happening now. There's this. I mean, Michael Pollan's book. It came out about a year after my Changing Our Minds. He says How to Change Your Mind. I mean, he's a journalist too. I mean, it's a good book, but had a lot of influence. It was like #1 New York Times bestseller. He just has this Netflix series that's out now based on the book. So a lot of people are seeing this, and there's a little too much hype and hope. In my opinion, with his take on it, that I think my work has been sort of more balanced, showing kind of I always include cautionary tales about what can go wrong. There are a lot of charlatans out there now, like there always are in religion or in America society in general. A lot of snake oil salesmen, a lot of con artists, a lot of sexual predators. You got to really be careful. You got to really be careful. There are people out there doing great work. There are therapists and spiritual teachers out there doing great work. And then there's a real dark side. And now that it's all the almighty dollars, I mean, everyone, all these, I mean, there's just a ridiculous amount of money poured into these startup companies, for psychedelic assisted therapy, having no idea how they're really going to make money off this, but they're raising billions with a B of dollars. And a lot of these companies are already tanking because people are realizing how, this is not a simple thing to set up clinics that can legally and responsibly do this work. It's happening, but so there's a lot of like miracle drug kind of talk, like mushrooms will cure cancer or everything, whatever it is, and there's just a lot of hype and irrational exuberance right now around it. There's a bubble that's already popping. The financial side of it is already popped, but the public opinion, So I think people have to be careful, a little more careful than they.
I would like everyone to be able to experience it, especially even if you have to sign a waiver and there's this thing of like, hey, you have ADHD or you have bipolar, we can't give this to you. Hopefully one day they'll make it to where people can be able to experience what other people can experience without going down like a deep end. But I also don't know if I want it fully in the government's hands, but I also think that there shouldn't be a whole bunch of just clinics all over the place. I would like more focused, more refined clinics with actual like verified people is what I'd say. Like you say, the dark side
That's
of
what
people.
they're doing. That's exactly what they're trying to do. Yeah. But the other problem with it is it's expensive, because a drug is not expensive, but the time of, I mean, for someone who does this work, a psychedelic therapist, whether they're underground, right, or at one of these emerging clinics, you so you have like maybe 1 or 2 sessions with the therapist beforehand. They screen you, they get to know you. Then let's say you're doing mushrooms. Okay, well that's like a 6-hour experience, right? So you're with a therapist. The clinical trials, there's 2 therapists for 6 hours. So, think of what a therapist costs, right? At least $100 an hour, maybe $300 an hour if it's a psychiatrist, right? So you got 10 hours. Then you should have like at least a few follow-up sessions to try to integrate, see how you're doing and integrate the experience into your life. That's the secret sauce of psychedelics.
Well, shit.
Therapy. How are you using this experience to change your behavior, right? So anyway, you're talking like maybe 10, 15 hours of time, right? So if
Unless you
it's
do what Ron White did, which Ron White quit drinking after he went to that retreat that gave him ayahuasca. And he did mention that the people that he was there with, there was like a hammock out back that you could go and sit in and everything. But basically, you either throw up or you get the shits. And this drug would
Yeah,
go
but
out.
that's a different model than I'm talking. That's the retreat center. I'm talking about a psychedelic therapist. It's like going to any therapist, right? I mean, it's not instant. The experience, the revelation might be kind of instant, but if you do it right, there's preparatory time, there's afterwards, there's integration. So all I'm saying is it can cost like, a couple $1,000s to do this in that model, and it's not covered by insurance. So
That's
the
the
so
goal. That's the goal.
that's the goal of MAPS. That's the goal of to get, and that could happen. If the FDA determines, and they're right on the cusp of doing it, that MDMA is a legitimate treatment for, say, PTSD. That's what they're looking at mainly. And there's a huge problem with that with the military, right? All these soldiers coming back from Afghanistan and Iran, Afghanistan and Iraq. There's a huge problem of PTSD among veterans, military veterans, and that's what's kind of fueling the government's openness to this. They know they've got a very expensive problem on their hands, dealing with thousands and thousands of soldiers suffering from this. And if this is effective to treat PTSD, then they're going to embrace it, and that's why MAPS was very smart. I mean, the first groups that they were kind of treating were military veterans, right, or rape victims, right. These are people have sympathy for these people, right? Our let's help our wounded warriors, right? Or with psilocybin, it's working with people who have a terminal diagnosis and are afraid of dying. They're dealing with cancer. Even if they recover from the cancer, they might still have psychological problems from having that near-death experience, right? So they're showing that. So the psychedelic assisted therapy with say psilocybin could help those people. Again, that's a group that there's a lot of sympathy for those people, right? These are people that are suffering, that they may be dying or they thought they were dying. So I think those are the groups where it's going to first emerge, and then there's a question of, well, but yeah, but what about the phrase is the betterment of well people, right? You don't have to have a diagnosis, right, to a mood disorder or psychological diagnosis to benefit from these drugs. So then there's a question of, well, what about everyone else who might get some, might become 10% happier after this or something, right? I think it's going to start with people. It's going to start with a medical model, kind of like what happened with marijuana, right? First there was medical marijuana, and now in many states, it's totally legal. I think that's going to happen. It might take longer with psychedelics to get to the totally legal.
I think we'll get there eventually. I can see it being a more widespread thing. The amount of time in the past couple of years I've seen people talk about it more casually, about tripping or doing something like that. And I'm in an area where it's highly illegal. So it's like,
Where are you?
I'm in Maryland. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, when I hear people talk about it, it's less stigma to it. And you start realizing it's going to be like one of those things where, like, under the guise, when you're not paying attention to it, it's just going to become way more normal to the point where they're just going to legalize it because everyone's already doing it anyway. And I hope it goes in that direction. I hope people get to experience if they want to experience it. I think making that choice is, everyone's kind of decision. It's like any kid that's turning 18 or 21 is going to have to come to grips with the fact that they're going to have to make a decision whether they choose alcohol or they choose drugs or not. They're going to come across it at one point in their life, and whether they get stuck to it or whatever, it's their decision to make. I think every parent has to make that kind of conclusion with it as well too. I think the best way possible to make sure it's a great experience is making sure that it is that set and setting, that they make sure that they have someone there that can walk them through something and not be like, I mean, when I tried pot for the first time was not a good experience at all. It was like 8th grade, like hiding, waiting, thinking you're going to get caught. You didn't even get high really the first time, but it's always those situations. If you cause people to go underground, you put them in more danger by making them go to this secret
Right.
location.
That fuels the bad trip. That fuels the fact that you're breaking the law and you're paranoid or worried about that. You're not necessarily paranoid. It's a legitimate worry if they can throw you in jail for smoking a joint or, eating I mean, it's kind of ridiculous that these mushrooms, which grow everywhere out of cow shit, right? I mean, they're easy to find, right? You can go out and find them. They're just growing there. And why is that illegal? Why does the government, I can kind of see, okay, heroin, yeah, I can even say with alcohol. I can say there's more reason to ban alcohol than magic mushrooms. You know.
It's way more addictive and more people die from alcohol. But Don, I appreciate the time you've given me to do my show, man. Seriously, you gave me some good advice, and not only advice, but just give me some good thoughts on stuff too. Because, like I said, there's going to be probably a point where I'm going to end up trying, it. Hopefully, I get the right setting situation, have someone that's able to walk me through it as well too. But I think it's good to get this out there just so people out there listening start having a different opinion on it. You're ingrained with the media or this long narrative of drugs are bad and all this type of thing. It's like a lot of people are casually doing drugs. They just don't talk about it. But where can people find your links, your website, your books, any social media profiles you have that you want people to follow you on?
Well, probably my website is donlatin.com, DONLATTIN.com. And I have 6 books out. There's little write-ups about the books, reviews of the books. I have on that page a stories link for more recent stuff I've been doing. Because I've been writing for this website, lucid.news, and other magazines and newspapers. So that's the best place to see. Also, I am writing a series of articles. We're going to calling it God on Psychedelics for lucid.news. So there's some of that. If you go to lucid.news, lucid.news, it's an interesting psychedelic news website. They're doing some really good work. And put my name in, you'll see about 10 stories I've written for them, and more recent stuff than the books. So.
Well, I'm going to link all your links in the description, Don. Seriously, it's been a pleasure chatting with you. You're
Hey,
welcome back
you too,
anytime.
Robbie.
And
Okay, thanks a lot for having me on the podcast.
thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank.